have the makings of a saint, and this should comfort and reassure and challenge all of us, since all of us, as we have already reflected, must also become saints if we want to get into heaven. But since all men do not become saints, and we know that all do not in this life, and plenty don't make it to purgatory, what is there about those who do that accounts for it, apart, that is, from the grace of God? Before we are done, we shall speak of the one thing, I've already promised it, that I see all saints as having in common, however disparate they otherwise may be. For now, let's trace some of that history of the development of the process by which saints are made officially. Our English word saint is derived from the Latin sanctus, a word that was used in ancient time, pre-Christian time, to designate persons and things that were set apart, that were to be distinguished from other persons and things because they were divine, consecrated to divinity or religion, either in themselves, in the case of persons, like a Vestal Virgin or deceased emperor, or for use in ritual in the case of things. It was quite natural for the first Christians to apply the word and equivalent Greek and Hebrew ones to God, to their rituals, and to themselves. That is, our earliest ancestors in the faith commonly spoke of themselves, commonly spoke of all members of the Christian community, of all the baptized, as saints or the saints. It is how they distinguished themselves from the pagan majority, even though, of course, members of that majority went right on using the word sanctus also. As long as the church was persecuted as she was during her early life, it was not unfitting that Christians should call themselves the saints. There were periods, after all, when any one of them who did not abjure the faith was liable to die for it, was liable to be killed by the state for no crime except that of being Christian. If you were going to be Christian, you had to be ready to die. To die for the faith, of course, is to be a martyr, and martyrs are saints automatically. However, the persecution of Christians during the first centuries of the church was not relentless, was not unremitting, as many tend to think. It came in three waves, really. The first wave began in the year 64, following the fire that consumed 2/3 of the city of Rome, then the capital of the world. Historians will probably argue forever as to whether the fire was the work of the Emperor Nero. We all have an image of him playing his lyre and singing when the conflagration was at its height, and he really did that on the evening of July 18th. But the fact is that he was out of town when the fire began and did not get back until the blaze was in its third day. Further, although this one in 64 was the most destructive, it was only one of numerous fires that had struck Rome during the preceding 8 centuries. No one has ever alleged that any of the others ever began by anything except accident. But such was Nero's reputation for evil, even in his own day. The popular opinion was accusing him of starting this one while the ruins still smoldered. Alarmed that it was the case, Nero scapegoated the city's Christians. He could get by with that. If he could get by with that, we need to remember that at the time, Rome's Christians were so small in number that theirs was seen as less than a minority religion, of which several existed in the city and were tolerated. It was seen less as a minority religion than as a cult, in the sense we understand the word today when we speak of the Manson cult or the Jim Jones cult. In the popular imagination, Christians were often believed guilty of stealing babies, poisoning wells, burning grain warehouses, that sort of thing. In any event, Nero ordered a general roundup of Rome's Christians, and most of those on whom his soldiery could lay hands were put to death. Many hundreds, and perhaps more, died. We commemorate the victims as the first martyrs of the Church of Rome on June 30th. Some were crucified. Some were sewn in animal skins and thrown to packs of hungry dogs to be torn to pieces. Perhaps most infamously, some were bound, covered with pitch, and set alight to serve as human torches illuminating Nero's gardens at a nighttime party. I think these latter are usually imagined as being bound or chained to the stakes on which they burned. That's how they were shown in the old 1950s movie Quo Vadis. It was another example of Hollywood prettifying things. In fact, the stakes were sharpened and the martyrs were impaled on them under the chin. What is interesting is that Nero's treatment of the Christians actually produced something of a backlash. The Romans were certainly already in moral decline, yes, but they were not yet sunk as low as they would become. They were something like us, circa 1960. We were already in bad shape then, but not as we are 40 years later after legalizing abortion, our women going on the pill, the distribution of condoms to high schoolers and in some places preteens, making the open practice of sodomy a human right, tolerating in the White House with Bill Clinton behavior that would not have been unexpected in Nero's palace, and becoming so used to killing that remains killing, even if done from 5 miles in the sky, that a president can announce, as on last June 1st, that the U.S. now has a first strike policy, and not simply does no one protest, he is applauded. As for the Romans, they were already used to seeing, yes, they were used to seeing some pretty appalling things, but many, even in Nero's court, were aghast at the sight of those human torches. Perhaps later they might not be, but that evening they were. So, the beginning of the first wave of official persecution produced the first real wave of sympathy for the Christians. Many felt that of whatever they were guilty, no one deserved to die like that. However, this wave of sympathy was only a wave. If a grain warehouse burned, an educated Roman might now suppose the fire was started by a careless watchman or a bolt of lightning instead of believing that it was set by a Christian arsonist. And the same Roman might himself no longer believe in the gods of the state religion. But he also saw that religion as important to the maintenance of social cohesion and order. And Christians menaced that order as long as they refused to pay even lip service to the gods. If he could, why couldn't they? We ought to be able to understand this Roman. After all, it is obvious that this nation, the United States, does not exist, does not live, quote, under God. To be more precise, it does, but we do not really believe it, or if we do, it doesn't matter. Our public life is predicated on the very proposition that it is to be regulated according to the will of the people, not God's. The legalization of abortion, the acceptance of homosexuality, all of the developments of the last 40 years, none of that could have come to pass except that the nation, though it may truly live under God, lives as if it did not. Yet, when a federal judge in California last June declared the lip service paid to God in the Pledge of Allegiance to be unconstitutional, our political leaders raced one another to the television cameras to express outrage. Well, it takes no great effort of the imagination to feature the very same men sitting in a Roman arena, turning thumbs down on the Christians after singing a hymn to Jupiter. After the first wave begun by Nero, the persecution of Christians did not become methodical for a long time. Throughout the 2nd century, it was haphazard and ill-organized. In the first decades of the 3rd, there was relatively little of it. The number of Christians in the empire was growing, and it seemed almost as if the empire was ready to accommodate them. But by the year 250, the very growth of the faith was alarming authorities. So it was that the Emperor Decius that year decreed that all Roman citizens must make public sacrifice to the gods. In every city of the empire, neighborhood committees were established, something like the ones that exist in Fidel Castro's Cuba today, or who knows, that we may eventually get with Operation Tips. The Roman ones identified citizens who failed to sacrifice to the gods. For 20 bloody years, it was during this period, in 258, that St. Lawrence was martyred. For 20 bloody years, Christians suffered under this second major wave of persecution. Then it ebbed. Once again, the faith, left more or less free, was able to spread. And once again, beginning in the year 303, authorities clamped down, and more violently than ever in the past. It was as if they now feared that the growth of the faith was already beyond their control. Their fear made them ferocious during this third period of persecution. One edict ordered the destruction of all churches, all Christian books, all objects used in Christian worship. A second ordered the imprisonment of all priests. A third condemned to death all Christians who did not abjure the faith, and for good measure, a fourth renewed the obligation of all citizens to sacrifice to the gods of the state religion on pain of death. Yet, the number of Christians did not now cease to grow. Clearly, critical mass had been reached. Unless the empire was made a desert, nothing was going to stop the spread of the faith. Indeed, by 313, the emperor himself was a Christian or close to it. That question remains controversial. We're talking about Constantine. In 313, he signed the Edict of Milan, putting an end to the official persecution.